So we're here to really talk about spiritual direction, spiritual guidance, spiritual companionship. It goes by several names. We all use them, and often we use many of them, as I do. And the theme of our conference is really, it's engage, and it's engaging with really what's been going on the last 2 years, but has been going on for many, many decades and centuries before that, which is this troubled world that we live in. And it seems that those troubles have become much more visible in the last couple of years because of COVID, because of George Floyd, because of Ukraine, because of so many things that are going on right now. And as spiritual directors and companions, we are used to accompanying others as they kind of uncover their own sense of the divine, of God, of the beyond, the universe, God, Brahman, Tao, however people might eventually refer to that deeper, more essential truth or experience, actually. So I wanted to gather some initial thoughts from you on how you see spiritual direction and spiritual companionship in this particular juncture, this particularly difficult juncture that we're living through right now, as we try to reemerge from our 2 years of isolation and struggle with it. And let's start there and see where we go.
Much. Well, I always try to look at the world through moral and spiritual lens, which means that I begin with myself. I am who I am because somebody loved me, somebody cared for me. So there's a note first of humility, acknowledging how inadequate I am, and at the same time how I can be better. And then there's an acknowledgement of piety, and by piety I don't mean uncritical deference to dogma or blind obedience to doctrine, but I mean the virtuous acknowledgement of the sources of good in my life that constitute wind at my back. And so I begin then with the ways I have been shaped on a moral and spiritual level to engage a world where the hounds of hell are always unleashed by hounds of hell. I'm using the language of the great Howard Thurman, who's one of the great mystical thinkers of the 20th century. He meant organized hatred, institutionalized greed, routinized fear, hypocrisy, and then domination, exploitation, subjugation. That's the dominant history of the species. There's no doubt about that. That's why Hegel called history a slaughterhouse. Gibbon called it a series of crimes and follies. And so to look at the world through moral and spiritual lens is to be in that world, but not of that world. It's to be over against that world, bearing a witness, grounded in a love, enacted by a courage and a faith. But that humility and that piety, I got a little wonderful companion here with the fly. But But at the center of it is an attempt to sustain one's love and courage and vision, and most importantly, one's calling, because one's calling has to do with one's unique and singular voice. I come from a Black people whose anthem is lift every voice, not lift every echo. So we're not just extensions of an echo chamber. We're finding something that is distinctive inside of us. And when we dig deep enough, we have then the possibilities of the human connection with others, because our uniqueness and our singularity allows us to begin to acknowledge how we can embrace others and where our human connection can be made. Now, we live in a historical moment where the American empire is undergoing immense decay. And the world has been Americanized in many ways, given the tremendous power of American culture and American military and American economic power. And so that decay means that we have to be mindful of the depths of the indifference to the suffering of others. the depths of the callousness in regard to how we treat others, and the willful blindness, the inability to see each other's humanity. You know, Henry James wrote a wonderful letter to Robert Louis Stevenson in 1901 where he says, no theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. Well, you can say the same thing. No religion, no religious tradition is kind to us that cheats us of an unleashing of seeing each other's humanity, and hence shattering the numbness and making the deeper compassionate connection to each other. And you could be in a Christian tradition like myself, St. Francis of Assisi, my dear sister Dorothy Day. I was just at the 89th anniversary of the founding of a Catholic Worker in Mary House, exemplary figure of shattering indifference and callousness. My own tradition, Martin Luther King Jr., and Fannie Lou Hamer, and Aretha Franklin, and those cloud of witnesses, as it were, who tried to enact very much what I'm talking about, stand on that love train, as it were.
Yeah, thank you. So all of this actually for me, you know, it's really tackling the issue of birth and death, and actually in this instance, death and birth, and the death of, particularly in this period of multiple pandemics, right? Not just the health pandemic, but the systemic racism, the pandemic of tribalism across the world that we're suffering, and war and intolerance is like we keep dying. We keep dying on multiple levels, and yet bound up with death is birth. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you see that connection between death and birth.
You know, I've taught now for 45 years in prisons and in colleges and universities, and I begin my classes by telling them, you have entered this space in order to learn how to die. Because in learning how to die, you learn how to live. Paul talks about this in the New Testament. Christians must die daily. Dorothy Day's great eulogy of Martin Luther King Jr., April 5th, 1968, Catholic worker. Martin Luther King Jr. learned how to die daily. And Plato says, philosophy itself is a meditation on and preparation for death. Philosophia, love of wisdom, is in fact a learning how to die. Montaigne, the greatest early European philosopher, Catholic in his own self-styled way, in his essays, you know, to philosophize is to learn how to die. Meaning what? Well, we have to examine ourselves. We have to be very candid with ourselves. And this takes forms of spiritual exercises. It could take forms of genuine contemplation. It can take forms of wrestling with the silences and the quietness inside of oneself in order for a better self to emerge. Because there is no growth, development, maturation without learning how to die, without self-scrutiny, without self-examination, without self-interrogation. Now that doesn't mean self-flagellation. We're not talking about self-hatred. We're not talking about trashing oneself. We're talking about acknowledging that the self has wretched potential and wondrous potential. There's a worse self, there's a best self. And to talk about death is in fact a sign of spiritual maturity. Now, I come from a tradition of Black people who have been wrestling with forms of death for 400 years in the modern world. Social death, slavery. Civic death of Jim and Jane Crow. Spiritual death, taught to hate themselves. Psychic death, giving up on trying to overcome because what is coming at one is so vicious, you see. So that to be on intimate terms of death requires one being fortified. I take the 6th chapter of Ephesians very seriously. Put on the whole armor. How does one fortify oneself? My dear sister Bell Hooks, one of the grand Buddhists of our time, I wrote a book with her, as you know, Breaking Bread. We used to wrestle with this all the time. How do we put on the armor of love, an armor of genuine sensitivity to others, a solidarity with the least of these, those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, and their lives have exactly the same value and significance as any other lives in the world. And we're not talking about color, we're not talking about class, we're not talking about gender, we're not talking about sexual orientation, we're talking about the rich and deep humanity of each and every one of us. I don't know, I think that these days are so grim and they're so dim, and yet, you see, I'm a blues man in the life of the mind, and the blues is about catastrophe. Strange fruit that Billie Holiday sang about, what our Jewish brother Maripol wrote the words. That's about catastrophe. It's not just about an isolated problem. B.B. King, king of the blues. Nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's catastrophe. That's catastrophe. What you gonna do about it? You got to get fortified. Examine yourself. Learn how to die in order to learn how to live by falling back on your family, your community, your friendships, your tradition, your heritage, and then mobilizing all of the spiritual and moral power from those sources, that piety that we started with, in order to what? Engage. It's not escapist. It's engaging. You're contemplating in order to more lovingly engage the world. And you engage the world not just with your mind. It's not cerebral solely. It's with your whole soul, with your whole body. It's with your whole heart, and with the best of those who came before filtering through you. See, my mother, Irene West, part of her afterlife is in my life. My father, part of his afterlife is in my life. When you look at me, I hope you're looking at the best of her, but I fall far, far short. I'm with my dear brother Samuel Beckett. I try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. Now, of course, he's deeply atheistic brother, but oh, there's a rich spirituality in Waiting for Godot. That's the favorite book of my brothers in prison. And most of them are deeply religious. Most of them are Muslims, actually. But Waiting for Godot is their favorite text. And we read Plato's Republic, we read Augustine's Confessions, we read Toni Morrison's Beloved, we read James Baldwin's essays. But there's something about how do you deal with time so that time doesn't use you, as it were. Not just in that prison, but all of us have a death sentence in space and time, as Franz Kafka reminds us. And that's why we need each other in trying to fortify ourselves to be forces for good, in the language of John Coltrane.